I'm Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty, and we've decided to do a podcast called We Don't Have to Choose. Why that title? Well, several years ago, I heard Rachel Barko give a presentation at the University of Minnesota, and she said that if the criminal legal system was a private corporation, it would have been bankrupt years ago. And that got me to thinking, why? Why does the criminal legal system not work to keep us safe? And what will keep us safe? That's what we're going to talk about on the podcast, that we don't have to choose between public safety and reform or changes or advancement, that those things we are trying to do here at the Hennepin County Attorney's Office will bring us public safety. Today, I'm really thrilled to welcome James Forman Jr., author of a Pulitzer Prize-winning book called Locking Up Our Own. Hi, James.
Hey, how are you? And I'm also the author of a newer book called Dismantling Mass Incarceration.
Yes, and one of your co-author on that book is Rachel Barko.
She's one of the contributors.
Contributors.
So it's a collection of essays, and she's one of the contributors. My co-authors are actually Maria Huilo and Premal Daria.
That's right. I'd forgotten that. And I know about that because I was one of the people asked to write a response to Professor Paul Butler's essay on why people shouldn't invest much in prosecutors.
Right.
So that was kind of exciting because my essay was about, if you assume that prosecutors are about punishment and not about problem solving, then he's absolutely right. But if you think of prosecutors as people in positions of power that can look at things in a very different way, using adolescent brain development and all the things we know about, then I think prosecutors are the most powerful entity in the system. So thank you. I do have that book. I've read it all. And that's one of the things I want to talk about. But can you tell people a little bit about your background?
Sure. Yeah. I'll say a few things, and if I miss something that you want to talk about, I'll certainly happy to talk about that. So I teach at Yale Law School, where I've been for over a decade. Before that, I taught at Georgetown and at Michigan law schools. Before that, I was a public defender in Washington, D.C., which was the first job that I had after law school. While I was a public defender, I also, along with David Domenici, another lawyer, we started a program called the Maya Angelou School, which is a school for kids that had been arrested or had been involved in the justice system. And that grew out of my work. You talked about problem solvers. So that grew out of my work as a public defender, seeing the problem of education or lack of education that so many of my clients were facing. And I'm really thrilled to say that school, which we started in 1997, is, recently celebrated 25 years of service in the Washington, D.C. community. And the teachers and the staff there continue to go gangbusters. So, that's
congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. So that's a little bit about some of my background. And again, if there's pieces of it that you want to dive more into, I'm happy to do that for sure.
Yeah, I did want to ask you about something. I was just reading a book by an author here, Uhuru Williams, and it was a book for young people, actually. It was on the March on Washington. And something I didn't know was that I knew that John Lewis's speech was controversial.
Right.
But I didn't know until I saw in this book that your father and John Lewis were in the, I don't know if you would call it the basement of the Lincoln Memorial. They were in the bowels of the Lincoln Memorial on an old-fashioned typewriter, I imagine, trying to type out changes to John Lewis's speech that would be acceptable for the people in control over that, but also something that John Lewis could believe in.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And that is the story. So, the great 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, it was the march that, people still remember today because of Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. But of course, like at any march, there were a number of different speakers. And one of them was John Lewis, the chairperson of, or I think they used chairman of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was one of the four major civil rights organizations in the 1960s. And it was in a lot of ways the most radical in those early years. It was led by students. And so, students tend to push. And my dad was the executive secretary, which is sort of, in today's lingo, we might call John Lewis the CEO, and my dad was the COO. My dad was in charge of internal operations of the organization, and John was the big public, outgoing, sort of outward-facing spokesperson. And they had a speech, and the Department of Justice officials were there, and they were reviewing some of the speeches, and other folks who were organizing the march. And there was some concern that the SNCC speech was, as you said, too radical. And so exactly as you're describing, there was this sort of moment down in the basement of the Lincoln Memorial where they were trying to hash out and going back and forth. And I mean, they only had a couple of hours. This was happening in real time on the day of the rally. And John Lewis's speech that he ended up giving is still, the speech that he ended up giving was still, for its time, quite radical. It was one of the one of the reasons why I think it might be interesting to listeners today is it was very focused on police brutality. And, there's an idea, I think, that's come out in, Black Lives Matter, the conversation over the last decade, that somehow the issue of police brutality is a new issue on the agenda of the civil rights leadership. But that's not true. I mean, it's an issue that's been part of the agenda of the civil rights movement since there's been a civil rights movement, right? We're talking about 1963. And John Lewis's, one of his main arguments in that speech was that the problem of police brutality has to be addressed for any other problem on the civil rights agenda to be successful. There's you should have him on the podcast when his book comes out. I just read a book by Josh Davis, a historian at University of Baltimore, and the title is slipping my mind, but I'll send it to you later. But it's about this. It's about how police brutality has long been an issue of concern to the civil rights community. He goes back to the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and he also talks about how local police, particularly Houston, Los Angeles, and New York, in his book, participated in the surveillance of the civil rights movement. So, we know about the FBI surveilling Martin Luther King, right? But he talks about how actually local police departments in some ways were more aggressive in their surveillance efforts, even than Hoover and the FBI. And before reading this book, I thought it was a Hoover story, but he really shows the way it was a question of local police, which I know, local issues are the bread and butter of what you do. So that will be an interesting book for you to take a look at when it comes out.
Yeah, thanks for the recommendation. And we are coming up on the 5-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd.
Right.
I wanted to go back a little bit because I've read quite a few books about the civil rights movement, including, and I was privileged to be able to meet John Lewis several times and talk to him a little bit, hear him speak. But also, SNCC, in my mind, was responsible for Freedom Summer. In Mississippi. And they were younger people who were pushing some of their Black elders or people, Black folks who probably are more widely known in some circles. But they were pushing them because they thought that they were too moderate. They weren't out there really pushing the establishment as much as they wanted to. And I think that was a little bit of the crux of the tension for the speech that John Lewis wanted to give. If I recall, there were Black leaders there who were not, who were more reluctant about his speech as well. And then the
That's
reason,
right.
Yeah, and the reason that I'm thinking about that as we lead into your book, your first book, Locking Up Our Own, that talks a lot, or you talk a lot
Mm.
about that tension with Black leaders. In fact, much of the book is about the criminal legal system, Black leaders, and what kind of happened there. Can you give us kind of a general overview of that book?
Yeah, absolutely. And I should, start in some ways by telling you how I got interested in writing the book, because I think it relates to the sort of the overview or the argument of the book, which is I mentioned before that I worked as a public defender in Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C. is a majority Black city. At the time that I was practicing, it was even a higher the city was more Black than it is today. But it had, you know, a Black mayor, or when I was a public defender, a Black chief. Eric Holder was the U.S. attorney at the time, so a Black chief prosecutor, a majority Black police department, a majority Black city council, and a lot of Black judges. And my colleagues and I in the public defender's office, our office was pretty well mixed and diverse, and it was probably about half Black attorneys at the time. But the Black attorneys, especially, we would often talk about how, we were going to court and we were fighting and representing people who were really kind of villains in the national conversation, right? Nobody wants to stand up for the criminal, but also in our local conversation. And we were seeing judges, including Black judges, give, very long sentences out of cases that were being prosecuted by a Black prosecutor, at least the head prosecutor, where the Black police officers had made the arrest. And, we talked about how we felt like we were the civil rights we were the descendants of the civil rights movement, right? Many of us had become public defenders because we saw mass incarceration as the civil rights issue of our generation. And clearly not everyone was seeing it that way, because we weren't especially popular figures in the courtroom as public defenders. And so I had to spend some time reflecting on this question. When I looked at the incarceration rates in Washington, D.C., they were similar to incarceration rates in cities around the country where there was much less Black political power, right? And I couldn't really figure out what was going on, and so I wanted to try to write a book that would make sense of the history of the criminal legal or criminal justice system in this country through the lens of Black leadership and Black communities and Black citizens, Black elected officials, Black law enforcement. I knew a lot of Black prosecutors, right, who had very different views than I did, and many of whom viewed themselves as standing up for and fighting the community in the same way that I did. And so I wanted to write a story. I think in some ways, some of the most interesting things you can do is write from another perspective other than your own. So I wanted to write a story that tried to make sense of how it was that even so many in the Black community came to endorse what I saw and see as a very problematic set of policies, mandatory minimums and transfer of juveniles to adult court and getting rid of parole. Washington, D.C. even contemplated, although it never happened, but in the 90s, when crime was as high as it was, there was discussion of the death penalty, bringing that in at the local level. So the book is really about how Black leaders, newly elected beginning in the 1970s, right? For the first time in this country, we had significant Black leadership because of the success of the civil rights movement, because of John Lewis and my father and all of the hundreds of thousands and millions of people who fought to bring down Jim Crow. We actually had Black leadership for the first time, and they came into power just as crime was on the rise. And I wanted to write about that tension that people felt, because on the one hand, They understood that the criminal justice system wasn't always the best response to the problems, but they felt this incredible pressure to do something about crime and violence that was consuming the community, and addiction as well. And, so it's really an account of how it is that in some ways Black America got on board with the program that has produced mass incarceration, even though all along the way people were very, very, very conflicted, right? So it's a kind of I hope, I wanted it to be a nuanced story that really got at how hard some of these issues are.
It's a brilliant, nuanced story. I read it a long time ago, and one of the surprising things to me, you were talking about traffic stops, stop and frisk,
Yeah.
and talking about how a major public figure said out loud, a Black man, yes, we're going to stop Black men. And
Yeah.
it's like something that wouldn't even be said today, although it happens today. And that person you've already mentioned was the Attorney General of DC, Eric Holder. So I'm wondering if you could talk to us about the dynamics that led to Black leaders supporting policies that created mass incarceration, including the war on drugs. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, that's the whole question of the book. So it's a long answer, but I'll try to give you a little part of it, and then you can, if you want to follow up, and we can go a little bit deeper. But since you asked about traffic stops and Eric Holder, I will, that's a sort of a later chapter of the book because that's in the 1990s. But it's as good of a way as any to jump into the conversation. So, as your listeners will remember, if they're old enough, in the 80s and the early 90s was the crack epidemic across the United States, and it hit cities and it hit Black communities especially hard. And there was violence, a lot of violence, and it wasn't especially violence associated with the use of the drug, but it was violence associated with the drug market. So it was violence associated with, for any of your listeners that have watched The Wire, right? That's basically telling that story, which is that there were different groups that needed to control geographic area, corners, and in high rises, the stairwells and the access to the high rise, because that's where the transactions were taking place. I mean, this is fast forward, but one of the reasons that today in 2025 we have a lot of problems still with addiction, but we don't have the same level of violence associated with the drug market, with the buying and selling of drugs, is because of the internet and people's ability to make deals without, you don't have to control a corner anymore to control a drug market. But then you had to control the corner, and that led to violence. And that violence really ripped apart communities. It made it so that parents didn't want to were afraid to send their kids to school because they were worried they were going to be shot. They were afraid to let them play in the park after school because they were worried that they were going to be slaughtered. And that produced an incredible pressure on elected officials. And in the case of Eric Holder, he wasn't an elected official, he was appointed, but he was the chief prosecutor. And the reason why I think Holder is such a good example of this story is he's not somebody who was in any way insensitive to race and racial oppression, right? He identified and identifies as a race man, right? He is somebody that I believe cares deeply about the health and welfare and safety of the Black community. But here he is as the chief prosecutor in Washington, D.C. in the early 90s. The homicide rate had tripled. Every community meeting that you went to, nobody was talking about, nobody. Not that many people were talking about over-policing. A lot of people were talking about that wanting longer sentences, more arrests, more prosecutions. And he gave a series of speeches on Martin Luther King Day, Martin Luther King Day, if you talk to, Black pub intellectuals or elected officials, they always talk about how, the day you're going to get asked to give a speech is on Martin Luther King Day. And one of the speeches that he gave in DC on a Martin Luther King Day in the early 90s was about how violence was doing to the Black community of Washington, DC, it was doing the same thing that Jim Crow had once done, that Black people were not free. In the same way that they weren't free in Selma, they weren't free in DC if they couldn't go out of their homes because of the risk of violence. So he sees this fear and he says, well, let's be more aggressive with traffic stops. And one of the amazing things is, and you alluded to this, they were very upfront, like on the radio, in a recorded interview. This is not like surreptitious. This was explaining the project. They said, we are going to be deploying officers to the communities where crime is highest. We know that's going to be Black men who are going to be stopped. We know that. We know we're going to do that. But we have to, because that's the only way that we're going to respond to this crisis that we're facing. So it was in a sense, it was kind of racial profiling explicit, saying we were going to do this, but saying that we had to do it because there was no other way. And one other thing to say about Holder, and because he represents a lot of the Black officials that I write about, he also knew, even as he said this, he also said, look, the criminal justice solution can't be the main solution. It can't be our only solution. He said, we have to invest in other areas. We have to invest in social programs, right? But as the chief prosecutor, he didn't see himself as being able to do anything about making housing more available or making jobs more available or making schools better. But he could deploy police and prosecution resources, and that's what he did.
So I think a big part of your book is pointing out how Black leaders did get or jump on board with harsh sentences, stop and frisk and all of that. They also asked for much more. Yeah. And the much more never really happened. And so I wanted to circle back to drugs, marijuana, because I think that's kind of where your story starts, with even like council members in DC. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, this was honestly one of the things that was the most shocking to me in my research. And I will always have to thank one of my research assistants. Her name is Rena O'Leary. She's actually a law professor at University of Wisconsin Law School now. But back then I was lucky that she was one of my students. And we knew there had been a debate about whether to decriminalize marijuana in 1975 in Washington, D.C. We knew that from newspaper accounts, but we didn't really know that much more about it. And Rena was able to get down to D.C., to go down to the bowels of the city council, and she found this, the microfiche machine, which as far as we could tell, no researchers had ever used. I don't think people even knew this stuff was there. But she also found transcripts of the hearing, a multiple day hearing in the 1970s on whether or not to decriminalize marijuana. So first of all, right, especially for your younger listeners who think that marijuana decriminalization is only a issue of their generation, this is 1975, right? Now, who's on the DC Council at that time? It's an almost all Black city council. And it's the first, it was the beginning of home rule in DC. So it was the first city council that had any real power and authority. And it was full of a bunch of people, some of whom had come out of the civil rights movement. And so it was a really interesting group. So it's a majority Black city council. Many of them some of them had been involved in the civil rights movement, right, which is just a few years earlier. And one of the members of the Dave Clark, one of the members of the city council, actually one of the only white members of the city council, who had worked with Martin Luther King in the 1960s and become a lawyer for poor people, he said, listen, we need to decriminalize marijuana, because he saw, right, he saw how many of his black clients and his black neighbors were being swept up in the system, has seen the problem that marijuana criminalization is bringing to the black community, and proposes this legislation to decriminalize. And the concern that a number of city council members had, and this was backed up by faith leaders, black church leaders who came and testified against decriminalization, was they said, you know, if we decriminalize marijuana as one of our very first steps as this newly elected black city council, the message that we're going to be sending to our young people, to black young people, is that it's okay to get high. And they weren't unaware. They were very attuned to the impact of racism. And they said things like, look, if a white kid in the suburbs uses marijuana and they fall behind in school, well, their family's going to have all the resources in the world to help catch them up. But our kids are already on the edge. They already have so many strikes against them. We cannot afford to have them going and using this drug, which is going to make it harder for them to succeed in school, harder for them to study, harder for them to graduate from high school. So even putting the criminal justice system to one side, this drug is going to be very damaging and demoralizing to black youth in particular. And then there was a critique even from the further left, which said, listen, we want to continue the fight, the civil rights revolution. And we need our black youth to be the vanguard. We need them to have their full faculties, right? That we don't want them getting caught up in this haze of apathy and I'm just going to sit around the house and get high. I want them fighting for social change, right? Was an argument. And that argument goes all the way back. Stokely Carmichael made that argument earlier in the 1960s. So it had deep roots in black political and intellectual thought. And the bottom line is decriminalization lost, right? So a majority black city council decided to continue to criminalize marijuana in 1975. And by the time I became a public defender, you know, almost 20 years later in the 90s, I was seeing the impact of that, because I was seeing clients who were coming in who had marijuana convictions on their record. And even though most of them didn't get locked up, because for the most part, you weren't getting locked up for that, at least in Washington, D.C., it did mean you'd have trouble getting a job, right? And it did mean you might have trouble staying in your public housing. So they're all kind of impacts. And these were impacts that I don't even think they could have foreseen in 1975. You know, they didn't talk about them anyway. They didn't talk about how hard it would be to get employed, you know, 15 and 20 years later. But I was seeing that, and my colleagues in the public defender's office were seeing that. So, you know, in some ways, that story in particular, I think, is a story of like best intentions gone awry.
Yeah, if we could go, I know there's a part of your book where you talked about when you were teaching at the school and seeing what was happening to young black men in terms of stop and frisk. What did you see, and what was the result of that to the black community and frankly to the police?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point that you bring up, because I do think that we don't talk about enough, you know, whether we're talking about corrections or whether we're talking about policing. I think sometimes we don't talk about enough of the way in which some of these policies and some of these mandates for how to police or how to run a prison actually can be quite devastating for police officers and prison guards. But yeah, to respond to your question, I mean, I took a year off from the public defender's office to help start this school, Maya Angelou School. In our first couple of years, we entirely had kids from the juvenile justice system in the school. Eventually now, over the years, it's expanded and we recruit from a wider array of students, although overwhelmingly, we still are recruiting students that haven't thrived in that traditional school system. And, there was a series of our first year in a new school building on the corner of 9th and T Northwest in Washington, D.C., in a neighborhood called the Shaw neighborhood, a historic kind of African-American neighborhood just off of U Street, which is Washington, D.C.'s, 125th Street. It's where all the jazz clubs and things operated in the 50s and 60s. Our students were subjected to a series of unrelenting kind of police raids when they were out in front of the building, kind of hanging out around the corners, sort of hanging out in the way that teenagers do. And these were what they called in DC. I don't know what what y'all call them, but in DC back then they called them the jump out squads. So these were unmarked cars, typically would roll up onto a corner. A group of 4, 8, or 12 officers would jump out. That's why they were called jump outs. And they would chase people down and throw people against the wall and frisk people. And it was all about drugs and guns, especially drugs. And, some kids would get away, but not everybody would. A lot of kids would get caught and stopped. And there were 3 or 4 this particular spring, and not once these kids were taking a break from class. Not once were any guns recovered, not once were any drugs recovered. But I could see it in the eyes of my students when eventually, that staff would run out when this sort of police operation had ended. And, book bags would be on the ground, and lipstick would be, and combs, and all of a person's, personal possessions, their notebooks and things would be strewn around. And, once it was over, the police took off. It's not like there was no okay, let's, we're sorry, let's work together on cleaning this up. Their attitude was like, oh, well, we know you had it, we just didn't get it. And their attitude was not in any way self-reflective, like maybe we should, we didn't recover anything. Maybe we should think about what we're doing here. And we would help the kids, we would help them pick up their stuff, we would bring them back into the school. But you could see in their eyes the way this damaged them, right? Because the message that authorities were sending them, right? This is the state. This is the most visible arm of the state that our young people have in their lives. And the state is telling them that even though they're in this school, they're trying to turn their lives around, right? This is what the kids know about themselves. The state is telling them that you will forever be a criminal. You are forever marked. You are forever a suspect. Your race and your age and your geography, right? The low-income neighborhood, these always mean that you are first, foremost, and forever a potential criminal. And you're going to be treated like that. Well, I have a 16-year-old son right now. And it's been a while, but I have distant memories of being a 16-year-old myself. And, think about your own child and the messages that you send to your own child. I think about how many times I've told my son, right, about how great he is, about how much potential he has, about who he can be if he works hard and makes sacrifices and, puts down his phone and does his homework. It's all built around the idea that you are worthy, that you are cherished, that you have the potential for greatness. And that's how all of us treat our own children, ideally, right? That's how we want everyone to treat their children. And it was the exact opposite message that was coming from the government to our students. And, I just don't think we can measure the damage that causes by the traditional metrics, right, that we use, again, it's not like anybody is going to be able to file a civil lawsuit and get any damages. You know, nobody was shot, nobody was paralyzed. I mean, these are like minor harms as the legal system, right, portrays them. But they were lifelong harms for our students, and they all grow out of this particular style of policing, that, you know, stop and frisk or pretext stops if it's a car, that became so common and so popular in the 1980s and 1990s.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that was a beautiful example of putting statistics into narrative too. When I
Mm,
was chief public defender, we looked at the stop data from
mm,
police and the hit rates, meaning how many times did they stop black drivers? How many times did they search them compared to white drivers? What did they actually find? And essentially, in cases where they stopped a black driver and searched that black driver, they found guns in less than half of 1% of the time.
mm,
And I think that's pretty consistent data with what you'd see around the country. It's just, even though I think sometimes police think they're finding more things, when you look at the actual data, they're not. And I've had conversations about this with community and police chiefs. And I recall one of them, you know, I said, if you want to look at it a different way, 99.5% of those black drivers were doing nothing. Yet they were put through the trauma of a stop and a search and all of the things you talked about. And I think it's really important for people to understand we're not talking about, oh, well, so what? No harm, no foul kind of thing. They just were able to drive away, you know, and that's the way it should be if you don't have anything. But that's not what white drivers experience at all. So thank you for that. I
yeah,
want to,
and
oh,
I could, if I could just say in response to
yeah.
that, you know, you're so right, and one of the things that I really wanted to emphasize, and that your reaction, I think, also really captures, is that as much as, you know, the recent conversation in the last few years has focused on violence, right? Like, obvious, you know, George Floyd and Eric
Mhm.
Garner and Breonna Taylor, but there are so, for every one of them, there's thousands more stories like the one you and I are talking about, the 99%, 99.5% that you were seeing in your statistics, that aren't, nobody's marching. There's no one was shot, no one was killed, and our system and our society more broadly, you know, doesn't treat those as the severe traumatic events that they are.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I was thinking about, especially since you worked with youth, when I first started, it was in my second month, we decided not to certify, I don't know what you call it in DC, move to adult court,
Yeah,
essentially.
yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, we call it
Um,
transfer, but the same idea.
Transfer. Yeah, same idea. So a 15-year-old boy who was involved and actually did shoot and kill a woman
Mm,
was manipulated by an adult, but
mm,
the family was successful in getting the governor to take away the case by going to
mm,
the attorney general. But what was interesting to me was that there were many in the Black community that said to me, you know, how can you do that?
mm,
How can you not send him to prison? Young
mm,
people will never get the point. You're incentivized, you know, people will know you're not doing anything and that sort of thing. And I know it's very nuanced and complex in more ways than I'm sure I will ever know. But it was an interesting, geez, I'm trying to figure out a
mm,
way to rehabilitate young people when we have that opportunity. And we know the result of prison. Imagine sending a 15-year-old to prison. And
mm.
so it do you I'm sure you have thoughts on why is it that there are some in the Black community who continue to demand harsh punishments in the face of, we know that it's in many cases Black boys, young men who are facing those harsh punishments.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the answer to that comes from the history of underprotection of the law.
Mhm.
So, you know, one of the books that I read that came out when I was a public defender, was Race, Crime, and Law by Randall Kennedy, a professor at Harvard.
Mhm.
And it's still in some ways a great book. I mean, I don't agree with everything in that book, but it's a great book. And one of the things that's great about it is that he really puts side by side. I mean, his basic argument of the book is that when we think about the criminal justice system and race, there's always been two problems from the very beginning. One is the problem that we tend to talk more about, which is the problem of over punishment, which was what you were responding to. And then the other problem, which we talk somewhat less about, although we do talk about it, is the problem of under protection, right? Which is to say the law not doing enough to protect communities from harm and from violence. And part of protection, not the whole thing, but a part of it is consequences for those who do create harm, right? Who do violate the law, especially when, as in your case, right, the most severe harm in some ways that we have, taking somebody's life. So when we think about Black America, what we know is that every Black person that you probably spoke to, certainly in my own life, I think of my father, right? So my father grew up in Jim Crow, Mississippi, and then, de jure Jim Crow, or I should say de facto Jim Crow, Chicago. And, as a Black man, he would tell me what other so my dad was born in 1928, right? So he would tell me what other Black people of his generation would say, which is that when we had a problem, when we had an issue, we never called the police. Why? Not because we did not want protection, but we knew that the police were only going to make things worse. They were going to only compound the harm. They were never going to take the crimes in our community seriously. They might just end up arresting the person who made the report. And so when you have that history, right, when you have a history of police, especially in the South, embedded with the Klan, when you have a history that says, that in the 80s, the Public Enemy song, right, 911 is a joke, right? You don't bother calling 911 because the police, if you're in a Black community, they're not going to come. The ambulance is not going to come. When you have that history, and then you finally get some amount of political power, right? Some amount of authority, the ability to go to a meeting with somebody who is the chief prosecutor in your community, you don't want to hear that the crimes that are taking place in your community aren't going to be treated seriously with severity, because and you've seen, right, when crimes that take place and you have a white victim, right? I mean, if you talk in the Black community, right, it's a well-known thing about how, there's sort of the missing white, there's like the 21-year-old blonde white girl that goes missing, and it's like on, national news for days. Meanwhile, there's multiple Black women of the same age whose families have reported them missing, and it seems like nobody's even looking for them. So when you have that background and that reality, one of the things that people want is they want the state to mobilize in their defense. And that's why they're frustrated, or people can be frustrated, when a perpetrator has now finally been identified, right? And the victim is Black. And it seems like we're not going to do anything to actually punish them. Now, here's the problem, and you know this in your position as better than anybody. What do we do about that? In my view, the problem isn't more punishment, right? The way to make that need, the way to meet the need to have the state take your harm seriously is not with more years in prison, at least not in most cases. It's to be able to have other resources that can be brought to bear for accountability so that what has happened to you, right, is not being ignored by the state, but we're offering something that is more expansive, more meaningful, more robust than just more years in prison. And that's where things like restorative justice come in. And, I can tell you that one of the things that I'm always the most shocked by is how small a world, like how tiny restorative justice is compared to the massive like punishment apparatus that we have. That even people who are, have access to resources and are able to read a lot and are supremely well educated. I mean, I have a friend who's lost a child to a drunk driver. And they want this person held accountable, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily want this person to spend 40 years in prison, but they don't want the state to do nothing. And that's the problem. That's what we've like offered people, right? Is like nothing or decades and decades in prison. And I think that the work of the next decade is really to build on some of these other alternatives which exist, which have been developed, which are there in every community, but are like tiny. They're like 1/10 of 1% of the prison system in terms of their, the number of people that they touch. And that's what we've got to change.
Yeah, you made many great points there. One that I think about is I've talked to people here about the fact that for decades, and Rachel Barco talks about this too, that we've all been kind of sold a bill of goods that the measure of a loved one or your own harm is the length of the punishment. And punishment is the key there. It's not about, because we know prison sentences are really, really way too long in terms of any hope of rehabilitation, that sort of thing. But certainly, I imagine if you were in the Black community, nothing was ever done often. And so the system is telling you your life, the harm that's done to you didn't matter at all. And so why you would want the same thing. I also, I reflect a lot. I've sat with a lot of people who've lost loved ones. And I was thinking when you were talking about your friend, I met with a man whose son was accidentally shot. It was a situation where kids were playing with guns and his son, young teen, was killed. And I remember sitting with him and I, way back when, had actually represented him as a public defender. And so
Oh,
he
wow.
asked specifically to meet with me. And a lot of what he wanted, he said to me, I
Mm.
just feel like if my son was white, you'd be doing something different. And
Mm.
I said to him,
Mm.
your son matters to me. Your son's life matters to me. And it does not matter. The fact that your son is Black has nothing to do with this. And, I'm sorry, the system doesn't have a whole lot to offer other than prosecution or not.
Mm.
And I also had an interesting experience with a group of abolitionists who were
Mm.
in their backyard enjoying music, and two 17-year-olds who were intoxicated came by. Things didn't go well, and one of them ended up firing a bunch of shots that killed one of the people and injured, I think, about seven others.
Oh, wow.
And it was remarkable. I met with the partner of the man who was killed a number of times, and other people who were harmed, and they were really struggling with, one of them said to me, can't we send, and also those two young people, 17-year-olds, had tremendous histories of trauma. Everything
Mhm.
you can imagine that
Mm.
you can imagine that you've,
Mm.
when you've represented young people. And I remember one of the women that was
Mm.
shot actually saying to me, can we send them? She said, I know this sounds dumb, but it wasn't. But can we send them to Alaska on a fishing boat or something and just like separate them from the community because they were struggling with the idea that, yes, these young people weren't safe in the community at the moment, but they also didn't want to see them go to prison.
Mm-hmm.
One young person we were able to work out something on. The other one, regrettably, turned 18 and just had a history that, and these are the hardest decisions I've had to make, where
Mm-hmm.
we actually did send him to prison
Mm-hmm.
because we just didn't have a safe alternative in the community. But we sent him for a little over 10 years. The idea being, he had a kid, he just had a baby, and he said he wanted to be a father, and so he could get out in time to be a father if that's what he wanted to be. So he had hope. But I remember one of the people telling me, well, this doesn't do anything for me. None of this does anything for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that is actually the truth of a lot of what we do in the criminal legal system. We can send people to prison or not, but it never brings the loved one back. It never undoes the harm that's been done. And I believe very strongly in restorative practices as a way to, as you know this, you've stood by, I'm sure, a number of people who are being sentenced, and you hear victim impact, and they have all kinds of questions. Why? And they never get those questions answered. And your client never gets the opportunity to to apologize, do the apology and that kind of thing. So I guess that was kind of a long, I think the tools that we have had as prosecutors are, the hammer or nothing. And I think lots of people don't even report their crimes because they don't want any of that. Other people come in here and find out that what we do have doesn't really help them with the trauma they've experienced, whether they want somebody to go to prison or not.
Yeah. No, it's very powerful and moving stories that you shared. And I can imagine there must be, dozens more that are similar that you see in your life and in your work. And I guess to that, I just would say that I really think it is incumbent upon us to, whether it's, by reaching out to the philanthropic community or trying to deploy government resources, but I just don't think that we should continue to accept that the dearth of other options, right? Like, I just think that we, you know, the, in almost every community, there is some group of people that is engaged in restorative practices, and in some places that's embedded into a little piece of the criminal justice or criminal legal system. Um, but we can do so much more. It's a multi-year strategy, right? You gotta have the funding, you've got to train people, you have to have protocols, like, and we always go back and default to the system we have just because it's there. But I think now is a really wonderful opportunity to try to say, okay, well, let's grow that some set of restorative practices and alternative practices, so that 5 years from now, when you're in that position again, because you will be in that position again, tragically, you're going to have you'll have more options that are available to you, and you can actually go to this community and go to the family of the person who committed the harm, and go to the group of people who were harmed and say, well, you know what, we could do this.
Mhm.
And as you said, that might include a trip to Alaska. I mean, I know the person said it right in this sort of, and we can't, what we don't have is we don't have in England in the 1700s, where they put people on ships, right, and sent them to Australia.
Australia.
Like, you don't have that, right?
Right.
But there are um, wilderness-based programs, right? Some of which have better track records than others, and you got to find the ones that really are doing, that are treating kids well and not just compounding the trauma.
Mhm.
But it might include something like that, for one of the people, one of the people who committed the harm, and it might include something like that for one of the people who was harmed. So I just think that we actually have examples now, which is different from the 90s. Like, I think in the 90s, it, maybe in, a Native American community, like there are places you could go, but they weren't much beyond that. And now there are, though. And so it's like on us to make that be everywhere. Like, I want it to be like I never, ever, ever had a judge say, Mr. Foreman, I would love to send your client to prison. I really think that's appropriate, but I don't have the bed space. Like, that never happened in 6 years of being a public defender, and I don't know that it ever happened. If it ever happened in your career, I'd want to hear about it.
It did not.
So why don't we, but let's do that let's build out a set of alternative programs where we always have space. We always have space for, if the person that committed the harm and the person who was harmed, and this is not going to work in every case, but if people want to do it, we should make it an option. I'm still like obsessed with the fact that my friend, for example, has never, like, they've been contacted by the victims. It's not that the victims unit, right, has reached out to them, but they haven't reached out to them with this offer, right? And that to me is just that to me is a tragedy, because here you have a family that would not only be willing, would be eager, because they actually would recognize that nothing is going to undo the harm, nothing. Right. But that is going to be better for them than 30 years in prison.
Yeah, and on a positive note, we hope to have that particular tool by the end of next year.
Oh,
so we're very excited about it.
All right, I have to come. I have to come out and spend some time.
Yeah. I wanted to end by circling back to your latest book. And just where do we go now? I know we talked a little bit about restorative practices, but here we are in the political environment we're in, where the media and like I was thinking about this, media stokes fear. We've got social media, all of that. Where do we go from here in terms of things that we can do in the criminal legal system?
Well, I think, we have to recognize the threats that are coming from the national level, right? And we have to stand up in defense of basic tenets of due process, right? And the rule of law. And I have, found myself talking much more in various settings than I would have done even a year or two ago. Whenever I'm talking to a group of law students, or I run a program called Access to Law School, which helps to support first generation residents of New Haven on their pathway to law school. And we recently had a graduation ceremony. And, normally I would have talked about their successes and how they've overcome all of these obstacles. But this time I talked about the Obrega Garcia case. And I read, right, this is the case of the young man who the United States government, the United States government sent overseas to this dungeon in El Salvador, admits they did this erroneously, has been ordered to return him, and as far as I can tell, has done nothing to make that happen. And this is a grotesque violation of the rule of law, of due process. And so I read from one of the court opinions written by a very conservative judge, right, documenting everything that had gone wrong and saying that the United States, the rule of law has to be more than this. And so I find myself now having those conversations more and more often, because exactly what you said, media and social media, I don't actually know what people are hearing. And I do know that people listen to neighbors, they listen to friends, they listen to people who they know. So I want to be the person who's out there talking right now about what it means to stand up for due process and stand up for the rule of law. So I think we just have to do that more than we've ever had to do it before, because because this administration is doing things and threatening to do things that we have not seen, that cross barriers and boundaries that nobody has tried to cross before. And we've got to speak up about it. And then we also have to recognize, as you do, given your work, that most of what it's going to take to make our criminal justice or criminal legal system smaller and more humane, most of that is going to take place at the local level. Most of that has nothing to do with the White House. Most of that is in cities, in counties, and in states. That's where prosecutors' offices are situated. That's where we either have mandatory minimums or we don't. We either transfer juveniles to adult court or we don't. We either have a meaningful parole system or we don't. We either expand restorative justice in the way that you're talking about doing or we don't. Those are all things that exist outside of the federal government, and we shouldn't let what's happening in Washington distract us from the work that we know we need to do at the city, county, neighborhood, community, and state level. And then I think the last thing I'll say is the Dismantling Mass Incarceration book has a whole series of different kinds of suggestions, right? We break the system apart into component parts, from police to prosecutors to defense lawyers to judges to prison, and then life after prison. And in each of those sections, there are readings about, well, here's what we could do in a community, or here's an example of a community working to make that part of the system more humane. Or, because we have abolitionist readings in there, working to abolish that part of the system. And we have reformers working to reform. So we try to present different takes on how you can work to make this system smaller and more humane. And what I would recommend to anybody is to pick up a copy of the book and, in community with 2 or 3 other people, read a chapter. If pick a chapter, say, oh, we want to read about policing. Okay, here's 5 or 6 short readings about what somebody in different parts of America is doing to make the police department in their community more responsive, right? Less racially discriminatory, more effective. Well, and then have a debate, right? You over dinner, you and those 3 friends that have read that short chapter together, and debate. Well, what ideas appeal to me in this chapter? What didn't I like? Because the point is, there's something that everybody can do. There's something that everyday citizens, residents, people that live in every city in this country can do to try to change and transform the system. And so it's really about each of us investigating for ourselves, realizing that there are pathways. We don't have to make it up. We don't have to be the first ones to ever try to do this thing, right? Somebody did it in Omaha. Somebody did it in Los Angeles. Somebody did it in Jackson. Someone did it in Philadelphia. Now let's tweak it and make it work for us in Minneapolis. Let's make it work for us in Madison. Let's make it work for us in New Haven. And so that's, I think, we did this collectively, right? And I don't mean that everybody shares the same amount of responsibility. Some people did a lot more harm than others, right? But we all, in some way, shape, or form, did this collectively, and it's going to require all of us collectively to be energetic and visionary and disciplined and loving and creative to undo it. But I think we can.
James, what is the book called, and where can people find it?
Sure. It's called Dismantling Mass Incarceration, A Handbook for Change, right? So there you have in the subtitle, right? A Handbook for Change. And it's available anywhere. You'd see, your local bookstore is where I would always go first, especially if you have a kind of a community oriented. Here in New Haven, we have a wonderful bookstore called Possible Futures, and most cities have at least one great local bookstore, and some have more than one. And you can also get it online. If you're an online person, Amazon and Barnes and Noble and those sorts of places would have it as well.
And I highly recommend it.
Thank you.
Thanks, James. It was so nice to talk to you.
Great to talk to you, Mary. Thanks for having me, and thanks for all that you're doing.
Thank you.